I'd like to welcome everyone to today's webinar, Overview of Agribusiness and Food Marketing. I'll introduce today's presenter, Dr. H.L. Goodwin, the Senior Economist and Food Safety Director at the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative. Dr. Goodwin is a professor and poultry economist at the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville, a Senior Economist and Food Safety Director at the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative, and the Director of Student Networking and Curriculum Enhancement for the Bumpers College. He joined the faculty of the University of Arkansas's Center of Excellence for Poultry Science in Agricultural Economics and Agribusiness in December of 1997. Prior to joining the university, he was the Agricultural and Food Systems Policy Advisor to the Minister of Agriculture in Slovakia and a Fulbright Scholar in Czechoslovakia. He was faculty at Texas A&M's Department of Agricultural Economics and served as the Associate Director of the Texas Agriculture Market Research Center. He received his PhD in Agricultural Economics from Oklahoma State University in 1982. HL, the presentation is yours.
Thank you, Brian. I want to welcome everyone to our third webinar in this series, Overview of Agribusiness and Food Marketing. What we're going to present today is a combination of some new concepts that we haven't looked at, but to give a better, broader context for agribusiness itself, we're going to look at some national information, some trends, some costs, consumption rates, a lot of background that I think will help illuminate the different structures within the food system that we'll be talking about as well in this presentation. So let's start out with recognizing that there's a lot more to do in agriculture than just look at food. A lot of times people think of agriculture as the production of agricultural commodities that are converted into food, but all these different pieces here have an effect and are part of the agricultural industry. And if you just think about what happens in agriculture, I had a problem here with my mouse. If you think about what happened in agriculture, all these different components of our economy go into making the things that allow agriculture to function. The manufacturing, construction, healthcare, all the different pharmaceuticals and those things that are involved in particularly animal agriculture, agricultural outputs are used as inputs for a lot of the personal care products, biofuels that make ethanol and biodiesel, the sports uniforms that come from, many of them from wool or cotton, leather, paper and ink that comes from various kinds of agricultural output. And so you can see the various products from agriculture that go into all aspects of our economy. It's not just about food. Many of you think about careers or specialties in agriculture. There are a lot of things that agriculture involves beyond the farm gate, and this is just a few of them. Let's look at U.S. agriculture. You see here historically, from 1975 to today, how many people can be fed from one U.S. farm. And you see in the bar chart, the blue portion is U.S. residents and the red portion is foreign persons. But you can see there that the growth is from 98 to 165 just in the last 40 plus years on how many people can be fed. It's incredible. 106 in the U.S. and 59 outside the U.S. With the population growth, there's going to have to continue to be increases in agricultural production. We're going to have to produce more product with fewer inputs. on less land. And so the future is bright for scientific discovery, for efficiency in mechanization, efficiency in labor utilization, markets, all the things that comprise the agricultural industry. Just think about in the Depression era, back in the 1930s, about 80 years ago only, about 1/3 of the population in the United States lived on farms. It's because it took that many people to produce the food that we consume, and there wasn't that much export then. Now, less than 2% of the U.S. population is involved actively in farming and agriculture. So there's been a huge increase in efficiency. So what does the food system look like? We've got a graphic here, and at the top are the input and facilitating industries. These are things like equipment manufacturers, agrochemicals, all the different pharmaceuticals that we mentioned earlier, manufacturing of packaging and so forth. And then the facilitating industries, finance, marketing, these aspects of the food system. Then you look in this middle section, and these 6 blocks are what I like to call the agricultural market chain. You start with agricultural production on a farm. It's assembled, and perhaps it's easier to think of in terms of perhaps cattle or wheat or corn, some of the large commodities. Many farms are producing these. They're aggregated into a central location and assembled. If you look at the case of a grain, at a grain elevator, this then is taken to a food processor or a manufacturer. If you look at wheat, it would be taken to a wheat miller, which would mill the outer hull, the husk off the wheat, grind it into flour of different qualities, depending on its use, its end use. And then it would either be sent directly to a manufacturer, or it could be sent into a wholesaler who would then distribute it to a food retailer through grocery chains. In the instance of a manufacturer, maybe you would send this to a bakery that made buns for McDonald's, or a bread bakery, and then that would be wholesaled out to the retailers and then eventually to the food consumers. And then underpinning all this are the regulatory institutions that allow our food system to work. For example, most of the fuel that is sold in the United States has certain octane levels that it must contain. It has certain additives that must be in there dependent upon the state. And all these different factors are managed by regulatory institutions. In most states, interestingly, it's the Departments of Agriculture that have a branch that manage these regulatory issues. There's USDA and its many aspects, like Food Safety Inspection Service, which is over all the meat processing and also the egg production or the egg selling. Then there's also, excuse me, the Ag Market Service, which regulates grades and standards so that the market can function, and it would communicate the quality, predetermined quality parameters from buyers to consumers, so that there would be no confusion with respect to what someone was purchasing on its quality. So that's kind of an outline of the food system. And what we're going to do is take pieces of this and explain that as we move through this webinar. But we're also going to highlight some different statistics and pieces of information that I think will illustrate this. So what about the food system? There are three primary sectors, and these three primary sectors are the food sector, the production ag sector, and the ag input sector. So we're going to talk about these briefly. The food sector is composed of food retailing, all your grocery stores, any kind of e-commerce, mail order, ordering over the internet and getting it delivered by mail. All of that is food retailing, as is purchasing food at an eating establishment. Food away from home is part of food retailing. Food service. What is food service? Food service involves several things. It involves traditional restaurants that we've been eating in for many years. It involves fast food restaurants, and it also involves institutional food service. Now, what's institutional food service? Food served at hospitals, cafeterias, in large manufacturing facilities, school lunches. All these things are institutional food service. The military, food service. And then the fourth piece of food service is food wholesaling. And food wholesaling stems from food manufacturing. Food manufacturing is a part of the food service industry, but it's also part of the wholesaling function. Food is manufactured, it's sent to wholesalers. A big one is Cisco, nationwide. Marriott has huge food wholesaling arm. And this food wholesaling then moves it from manufacture into these other food service and food retailing sectors. And what makes all this work and work very well in our food system is transportation and storage. We have, it is said that we have at any one time 3 days worth of food that is on the roads being transported. We have a lot of food in cold storage. We have a lot of food in warehouses, but we try to minimize the amount of food that we have just sitting around into a just-in-time system of delivery, so that you're not incurring the costs of storing food when you could have the storing of commodities, then manufacture the food and transport it to its end use, whether it's a food manufacturer, food service, or food retailing. So transportation and storage is a big part of this. What's the production agriculture section look like? We're going to talk about several things as we proceed through this. One is farm size. Farms have been getting larger and fewer in number for many, many years, up until the 2007 agricultural census, when we began to see sort of a leveling out of this. There were many, many young and new farmers entering that had smaller farms. So the numbers have kind of leveled out on farm size, at least temporarily. Farm income. Most of the farm income that's generated in the United States is generated from very large farms. And we'll see as we proceed through this presentation some different representations of that and how that breaks out by farm size. When we look at animal agriculture, a lot of you, right now the Farm Bill is being debated and the budgets, a lot of you here talk about this great subsidies that farmers get and all this money that's being spent on subsidies. We'll look at that as we proceed through here. But let's just say now that animal agriculture benefits from these subsidies indirectly because animals are consuming the grain, and most of the subsidies that exist in agriculture are for grain-based activity. The direct subsidies through crop agriculture, either through price support, crop insurance, loan rates, loan payments, disaster payments. So these are focused on crop agriculture. And then another component of farm income is off-farm income. A majority of the farms that are in production have at least one spouse that works off the farm. So that supplements the farm income. Many times it's to get benefits for the family. And there are other reasons why there is off-farm income. It helps bridge cash flow. And many times people will dedicate their off-farm income to their family living expenses. And then that way they can separate and have their farm income as a separate enterprise. And we'll look also at farm ownership structure. You hear a lot about corporate farms. We'll look at that and maybe get a better understanding of what farms are really corporate and which ones are, quote, family farms, and if there is a difference. Talked about farm size already. And then we'll look at competing uses for land. Many areas that I would call in the urban fringe are often good agricultural areas, but there's intense competition for the land, for real estate. Real estate many times is more profitable to sell it for development than to keep it in agriculture. So one of the things that we'll look at is some competing uses for land. A little bit more detail about the agricultural input sector, just to make you aware of it. I know most of you, this is obvious, but it's good to remind everyone. What are the manufacturing parts of the ag input sector? There's the equipment, the chemicals, and then the genetics. And people many times don't think about genetics as being part of this, but particularly in poultry, both chickens, laying hens for table eggs, and turkeys, and also to a lesser extent in swine and dairy, and some in beef. Genetics are big business. And so that's an input sector. Improved bloodlines and crossbreeding, pedigree breeding, all the things that go into developing a good breeding program for animals, and in addition for your plant products. Many people don't think about genetics for corn, soybeans, wheat, rice, but I can assure you the genetics part is a big, big part of the ag input sector. Input distributors. What in the world's an input distributor? Well, there are corporations that distribute inputs. For example, many of your agricultural chemical companies are input distributors. The fertilizer companies are input distributors. John Deere and Case IH and other equipment, New Holland, that manufacture and distribute through their dealers equipment. All those are corporate. And then we have cooperative input distributors, and these are simply thought of your farmer cooperatives that many of us have grown up with and seen operate. So a cooperative is an input distributor in that they bring inputs to a location where agriculturalists go and purchase them, and therefore they're distributed by the cooperative. And then we have services and financing, custom labor, custom harvesting, custom land leveling, all these kinds of things are custom services. We have marketing services. And then we have what is most obvious to everyone, the loans that go through the banks to allow agriculture to operate with adequate financing so that it can cash flow and continue to produce. So now let's look at the farmer's expenses. If we look at farmers' expenses, we have farm production expenses. These are total farm production expenses, and many of these graphics are from the American Farm Bureau Foundation that are taken from the Economic Research Service of the USDA. But you can see here in the last 20 years, farm production expenses have doubled to $350 billion in the year 2016. So how did these increase? The farm level expenses were down slightly from the highs in 2014, but were 50% higher than expenses in 2006. So if you just look at agriculture, these are the percentages of farmers' expenses that we have information on. 16% for feed, 16% for capital, roughly 16% for fertilizer, seed, and chemicals, 12% for labor, 10% for interest, property tax, and other fees, 6.5% for livestock, 6% for rental, 5.5% for utilities, 2.5% for marketing, storage, and transportation, and then 10% for miscellaneous. So that's how a farmer's expenditure dollar is split up. Obviously, people that are in animal agriculture are spending less on fertilizer and seed, and people in crop agriculture aren't purchasing feed. But as a whole, for agriculture, these are the expenditures and how they're broken out. So now what about when you spend $1 on food? 84% of that dollar spent on food, and this is at the retail. This is not talking about food at a restaurant. When you go to a retail outlet, a grocery store, 84% of every dollar you spend goes for off-farm activities. Off-farm activities are everything in that marketing chain beyond the farm gate. In other words, that does not involve directly agricultural production. So transportation, processing, packaging, shipping, selling, all the different things that are involved. And only 16% is on farm. And some information came out about 2 weeks ago, and I didn't have a nice pretty graphic for it, but in fact, this past year in 2017, the off-farm share was 86%, and the on-farm share had decreased to 14%. And this varies depending on what happens, what kinds of activities have to be performed on the product so that it can be consumed. For example, you see there a food share of the food dollar is 2 to 4% for bread and cereal, but as much as 35% for fresh market products like fresh produce, and it's even higher for eggs. There's not much that happens to an egg after it leaves the farm. It's washed, it's candled and checked for defects, then it's packaged and shipped and refrigerated, and there you have it. So the fewer things that are done to a raw product, the greater the share of off-farm income. I mean, of on-farm income versus off-farm. This, I thought, is an illustrative kind of a table. And what's shown here are the top 3 states by value of cash receipts for each of these 10 U.S. farm products. And you can find your state there if it appears. This information, again, was taken from the USDA and assimilated by the Farm Bureau. And so you can see there that Nebraska, Texas, and Kansas are the top states in cattle and calves. Dairy products, California, Wisconsin, New York. Chickens, Georgia, North Carolina, Alabama. Turkeys, North Carolina, Minnesota, Indiana. Wheat, North Dakota, Kansas, Montana. So these are 10 of the top farm products and the top 3 states where they're produced. And so this just gives you an idea about the diversity and actually the magnitude. $78.229 billion of cattle and calves. That's cattle and calves on the hoof. That's not beef in the hanger. That's cattle and calves. $47.2 billion worth of corn that's harvested. So huge numbers, and there's the distribution by state. Look how many times Iowa appears here. Chicken, eggs, hogs, and corn. So it probably wouldn't surprise you to find out that Iowa and California, which appears in hay, dairy products, and then it's not shown, but fruit and vegetables, fight it out for number 1 and number 2 in terms of ag value. So now what happens to all this production? Do we consume all of it here in the United States? Is it shipped somewhere else? Here you can see that $135.5 billion worth of American ag products were exported. And the countries shown in red account for 61% of all agricultural exports. China, Canada, Mexico, Japan, and the EU countries, EU 28. And then you look in that right column, the US share of world production, 36% of corn and 34% of the soybeans that's produced in the entire world are produced in the US. Amazing numbers. Almost 20% of the beef and veal, 16% of milk, 13% of cotton, and then 8 and 6% respectively for wheat and apples. So if you look, excuse me, if you look at the amount of agricultural production that's exported, it's sizable. And you can see that without agricultural trade, agriculture really has a problem in making the kind of income that it does, because with our production and without that export, we would experience surplus, which means you have a drop in price. So what about the trade balance? There's a thing called trade balance. What we import and what we export. And so here are the numbers. 135 billion in exports, 115 billion in imports. What do we import? Fresh and processed fruit, fresh and processed vegetables, corn, coffee, cocoa, grains and feeds, wine and beer, beef, veal, and pork. We've already seen the exports here. So about 25% of all U.S. ag products by value are exported yearly. And there are some of the numbers. So it's important to think about the impact of trade and the trade balance. There's a lot of discussion going on now about trade policy and what impact that'll have on farm income and availability of food. So it's good to know what baseline we're operating from as we think about these topics. So now let's go back to this graphic on the food system. We've looked at some of these pieces here, and we're going to continue to look at more of these. What I want us to do now is think about the other, this end here. We've talked primarily about ag production. Now we're going to talk about the food consumer, and we're going to explore just a little bit about the consumer and about how prices are determined and what that tells us about the marketing that we need to have in our ag business system. First thing we need to understand is consumers and producers have competing goals. They don't have the same goal in life. What is the goal here for a consumer? And think along with me as a consumer of products and see if this fits with what you think. Consumers want variety. No one wants to go into a grocery store and see an entire aisle of Cheerios and no other kind of cereal. People don't want to only have one type of meat or one type of product. So they want variety. They want it in different forms. They want it in different sizes. They want it with different shelf lives, different tastes. So variety is important. But they also seek a low price. Almost everyone considers price when they buy food. So price is important. Why do consumers want to pay as low a price as possible? So they'll have money to spend on other things, to add variety to their life instead of just buying food. And then they want to get the maximum utility. That means they want as much satisfaction from consuming these products as they can possibly get. But what do producers want? They want specialization. Think about a farm in Montana that is wheat as far as you can see. Or think about a dairyman. A dairyman specializes in dairy cattle. Most dairymen don't have pigs and they don't have orchards. They specialize. So producers want to specialize so that they can get a higher price, or maybe better said, or another factor in that high price, low costs. Producers want to specialize so they can produce more of something more efficiently at a lower cost and make that higher quality because they're specialized and therefore receive a higher price. Which means producers want profit. That's where their utility comes from making profit. Consumers' utility comes from consuming a product. So you see there, they have different goals. And what the market system does is reconcile these differences between consumers and producers. And it does it through price. Price reconciles the differences and allows these competing goals to be met. So let's look at how that happens. Let's look at what price really is. The value of a product from the producer's view is known as the offer price. If I have a steer, or let's say I have a bull for breeding and I think that bull is worth $5,000, that's the offer price. If you're coming to look at that bull to buy it for your herd, The value from your perspective is known as the bid price. So I might offer it at $5,000. You might bid $4,000. And then what would happen then? Well, we'd negotiate, hopefully. And the price at which a product is taken off the market, or where the producers and consumers agree on price, is known as the market clearing price. So if you and I were negotiating over this bull, and let's say we agreed on a price of $4,400, then the market clearing price at which the consumer and the producer both agreed on price is market clearing at $4,400 for that bull. And this goes on every day, no matter what you buy. If you go to a grocery store and you're shopping, you might choose to buy one product based on your budget today, and next month you may choose another product based on your budget. What does a budget have to do with it? It determines how much money you have to put into your bid. So all these things are very, very interrelated. And when I say bid, please don't think that we're going to an auction here. A bid price is a term that means what you will pay for the product. So all these things are interrelated, and that's how market clearing prices are determined. So now let's look at the marketing system. We have a raw commodity. This is the market chain that we talked about earlier. A raw commodity at the producer end, it's the producing function. The assembly or the aggregating function, bringing products from many production locations to a single location, where it is either sold or transferred to processing or manufacturing. That manufactured product is either warehoused, stored, and distributed, or it's moved from a wholesaler directly to a retailer, which is the point of selling. And then it winds up at the end user or the consumer, which is the consuming part of this. So we've tracked the raw commodity from the producing function all the way to the consuming function, looking at the different pieces of the marketing system and how they impact the product. Now, these next 3 or 4 slides are a little bit of review, but I think we need that at this point because we're going into some more information in a little bit later. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. I'll just page through these slowly so you can refresh in your mind. Remember, this is the 3rd webinar, so we're assuming that the first 2 have been watched so that you can understand this material. So the utilities of marketing, from changes in physical condition, extension of useful life, change in location, ownership transfer, and then advertising and labeling is the information function. The functions of marketing. There's the exchange functions, buying and selling. It's the exchange of ownership. The physical functions, transportation, storage, processing, and financing. So here we have the aggregation function, the assembling of product, the warehousing, storage part of it. We have the manufacturing part, and then the physical function of financing, which allows all that to happen. And then the facilitating functions, market information, which is provided and readily available in many forms, free to the public through USDA. There's the risk-bearing function, which we talked about being the commodity markets and the contract and speculation. And then there's standardizing and grading. It's a function of USDA so that market information is clear and understandable. So now let's look at how a firm markets production. They do it by what's called the 5 Ps. There's the product that involves the characteristics of that product, nutritional and sensory, and packaging. And we're looking here at food. So nutritional, sensory, and packaging. How does it taste? How does it smell? How does it look? What kind of package is it in? Is it easy to open? Is it resealable? Does it have to be refrigerated? The nutritional, what's the nutritional label on the side in terms of calories, protein grams, milligrams of sodium, et cetera, et cetera. Then we have the price. We talked about the market clearing price. But there's several there's several pricing mechanisms. You can price at break-even pricing, which would not be advisable over the long haul because you go out of business without profit. There's cost plus pricing. This product cost me $10 to manufacture. I want to make 20% profit, therefore I'm going to sell it for $12. There's the roundup or the even price. You see a lot of things priced at $1.99, $3.99. Then there's the roundup pricing, $10, $15, the even pricing. Then there's at market penetration or skimming pricing. At market would mean that you would look in the market to see what similar products we're selling for, and that's where you'd price yours. Penetration pricing would be you'd want to penetrate the market by offering the product at a slightly below market rate to gain market share. And then price skimming is much more sophisticated. That's where you enter a market at one price, get the customers from that, then lower it slightly, get more customers, lower it a little bit more and get more customers. It's the reason they call it price skimming is, for those of you who have ever done this, it's like skimming cream off of milk. The heaviest cream is at the top, and as you get closer and closer to the milk, there's thinner and thinner cream, and the cream in this case would represent profit margin. Then there's promotion. How are you going to advertise and position your product? Where are you going to place it in the mix of your products that you manufacture, the different brands that you have? It's what positioning is. The place, what is the location and type of outlet where you place your product? And then finally, people, to whom are you selling your product? What's the socioeconomic and demographic, educational level, family income, age, gender? Then we also have life cycle. Are the people married? Do they have children? Do they have young children, school-age children, children over 18 that are no longer in the home? Are they retired? Are they widowed? These are so-called life cycle components. So these 5 things make up how a firm decides to market their production. Very, very, very important determinants of profit. So now we've talked about competing goals. And how things are marketed. So let's look at food consumption for a minute. The type and quantity of food depend upon a country's economy. Or a region's economy. If you're looking at an undeveloped country or an underdeveloped country, you'll certainly have different kinds of food consumption than you will in a developing country or in a developed country. Let me explain this just a little bit with the next few bullet points. What I'm referring to here in type of quantity depend on a country's economy. Nutritional needs are met first. And which ones of these are met in someone's food consumption is determined by their income. First, people satisfy their caloric requirements. How many calories does it take to maintain your living? Then they satisfy protein requirements. As you get, and you look across the world, as people's incomes increase, they consume more protein. Once they meet their protein requirements, they start to look for value added. And this is a convenience perspective where you're looking at how is value added? Is it flavor? Is it packaging? Is it level of preparation? What kinds of value have been added that people will pay for to either give you more convenience or a more satisfying product? Percentage of income spent on food. We're going to look at something on the next slide that will illustrate that. Price comparisons of competing foods. When somebody is trying to determine what they're going to buy, they'll look at price comparisons of foods that are competing. Many times it's just a brand comparison. Are you going to buy Green Giant peas, or are you going to buy store label peas, or are you going to buy generic label, white label with black ink? It depends many times on what you're willing to pay for a product and what percentage of your income that is. And then we look at comparisons of quality, type, and image. These are also things that people look at to determine their food consumption patterns. So let's look at the disposable income percentage spent on food for different countries around the world. Americans pay the least for food, 10% of their disposable income each year. Now, that doesn't mean you listening to this is spending 10%. That means on average, 10% of the disposable income is spent for food. 13% in France, 23% Mexico. You see there Nigeria, 57%. So food is relatively very cheap in the United States. We pay the least percentage of our income for food on average across the country. I mentioned a while ago, we're going to talk a little bit about the federal budget and spending. This is just a graphic of the entire 100% of the U.S. budget is $42.5 trillion. I can't even think about that. 66% of this is healthcare and so-called entitlements and interest on the public debt. National defense is another 13%. Agricultural baseline is 2%. What does that mean, agricultural baseline? That means everything that's spent on anything to do with USDA or agriculture comprises 2% of the total federal spending. And if you take that and subtract out food assistance programs and nutritional programs, you get to 0.3%. So these massive subsidies that you hear about in the news amount to 0.3%. but also in that number are all your NRCS agents, all the support for food inspection, every part of your federal technical assistance that goes into agriculture, all that, including research and education in agriculture, makes up 0.3% of the U.S. budget. Here's a compilation of the ag budget. Ag programs are 16% of the USDA budget. 71% food assistance and nutrition programs, and 7% on conservation and forestry, and miscellaneous another 6%. So there's where the 2% of the ag budget goes, how it's split out. Talked a little bit about corporations and farm size and family farms and so on. What I wanted to bring in here is just this graphic that shows that 99% of all farms are owned by families, and they can either be sole proprietorships or family corporations, partnerships between brothers or sons and dads, or moms and daughters, or sisters, some kind of family corporation. Only 1% of the number of farms is owned by a non-family corporation, and only 11% of the total ag product sales are held by non-family corporations. So just to put it in perspective, about 90% of all U.S. ag products are sold and produced on family farms, irrespective of whether they're sole proprietorships or family farm corporations. Now, what about individual food behavior and food buying behavior? Let's look at some things here to get an idea about how people determine what food they're going to consume. And you'll see the graduated fonts here. The largest determinant are the regional preferences, determined by where people grew up, what region they live in, determines to a large degree their consumer food behavior. Food availability and technology is another one. Ethnicity and culture is the next determinant. Education and socioeconomics, level of education, the level of income, what economic structure you're in will determine your food consumer behavior. Age and sex, and then finally, individual psychological and physiological makeup. So those are the determinants of consumer behavior. It makes up food choice. What do people choose to consume? Which leads to how they buy. Now, this is not only where do they buy, but how often do they buy? Are they repeat buyers? And it's determined by their attitudes, their motives. Many people have motives other than just fulfilling a diet. When they buy food, they may want to support sustainable industries, people who recycle, organic, whatever. They may have other motives than just the basic food that they eat. How well informed they are, how they make decisions, and that differs with initial purchases and repeat purchases. Many people are adventuresome and they'll be one of the first people to try a new product. Others, for whatever reason, may have to have recommendation for someone or try it somewhere before they choose to buy it. And then whether or not they repeat purchase is typically based on their degree of satisfaction with the product. And then obviously consumer comparisons of quality, type, and image will generally drive the decision. So all these things that you see here determine food buyer behavior of foods that were selected based upon the food consumption choices in the previous slides. It's a very, very complex set of parameters that people go through when they decide to buy foods. So now here's something just to give you an idea about what the annual per capita consumption is of different foods. Let's look at this. Eggs, and this is in number of eggs, 251 eggs, roughly 196 pounds of cereal products, 126 pounds of fruit, 118 pounds of red meat, 66 pounds of poultry, 22 gallons of fluid milk, 30 pounds of cheese. So this is just basic annual per capita consumption of major foods. You look at this, you think, wow, do I really eat that much food? Well, yeah, you really do eat that much food. And the interesting thing is to imagine that my 6-year-old grandson and my my 82-year-old aunt aren't eating this much, but perhaps myself and my 25-year-old son are making up the difference. So this is average annual food consumption per capita. Here's just a little something I like to put in here to show you when Food Freedom Day is and when Tax Freedom Day is. In 1950, roughly, when I was born, in the early 50s, in 1953, you see that Food Freedom Day was about the 20th of March, and a Tax Freedom Day was about the 5th of April. So it already took longer to pay your taxes than it did to feed yourself. And taxes have been continued to increase slightly. Now this diagram shows that they've leveled out, and food prices relatively continue to decrease. So right now, your Food Freedom Day is February 6th. Tax freedom is April the 11th. Just an interesting way to look at the relative share of our income that's spent on taxes or on feeding ourselves. I think everyone likes pizza. In fact, my grandchildren have 3 major food groups: chicken fingers, pizza, and hamburgers. And so let's look at pizza here. What are the top states that produce the different pizza ingredients that you see here? And while you're looking at that, this gives you an idea of the diversity of agriculture across the United States and where these different products are predominantly produced. You'll see California appearing multiple times, particularly when you're looking at dairy products and specialty products. 3 billion pizzas annually in the United States. That's amazing. Average family eats pizza at home 30 times every year. Is that how often you eat it? It's not how often we eat pizza, but it's just something to think about. So here we are back at our food system. We're going to talk a little bit about planning and management responsibilities. So we've got about 10 or 15 minutes left in the webinar. These next factors are extremely important. When you are in agribusiness, you must figure out and delineate the management responsibilities. And to be successful, all managers have to be able to do 4 basic functions in their agribusiness: marketing and selling, financial management and planning, production and operations, and personnel or human resource management. And whether you're the one that does all these, whether you have a spouse or a sibling or someone that you hire to do these functions must be conducted properly for your agribusiness to be successful. So let's look briefly at managing an agribusiness. What is management? It's an art and a science of pursuing desired results with the resources you have available. So you know there's an art to it. It's not just all figures and calculations and formulas. There's an art, particularly when it deals with production and when it deals with managing your people. A manager is somebody who provides leadership for the management, and they're the catalyst and communicator for change. So that's what a manager does. They're the one that provides the leadership and communication. So key management tasks in an agribusiness: planning, and we're going to go through each one of these in some detail. Planning, organizing, directing, and controlling. You may be saying to yourself right now, geez, I'm not very organized. What am I going to do here? It's time to figure it out. We'll see as we move through here. First, on planning. There are really 3 kinds of planning. The first is strategic planning. What's your long-term course of action? You got to have a mission and a vision statement. What are your goals? What's your action plan with specific objectives to allow you to achieve those goals that you set forth? So this is the strategic aspect of planning. Then there's the tactical aspect. This is short-term course of action, usually within a growing season or even pieces of growing seasons. Your tactical planning has to be consistent to allow you to achieve your strategic plan. How do I accomplish these strategic objectives that I've set forth in my plan? It focuses on implementation. So when you're talking about tactical, you're talking about implementing. And then contingency planning, sets for alternative courses of action. This is where a lot of people really run up against a problem. You've got to be willing to, you spend all this time on your strategy, you got your tactics figured out. Things change. You may have to make mid-course adjustments. You may have to go back and change your objectives due to changing conditions in the economy or in agricultural policy or, in weather across the entire market. Who knows what these contingencies may be? You may also decide that you made a strategic error and you want to refocus your business. That's okay. This is what a contingency plan is for. Give yourself an opportunity to refocus your objectives based on strategic changes. So what's the planning process? This will look a lot like the scientific method that you may have seen before. First thing, gather your facts. Number two, analyze the facts. From the facts you've gathered in your analysis, forecast what change might be. Set your goals and performance objectives. Develop your alternatives. And then evaluate your results. So that's the planning process. Gather the facts. Don't go on what you think or what you feel. Gather facts. Analyze your facts. Forecast the future, what change might occur based on the facts and what you've seen in the past. Set goals and performance objectives. Develop your alternatives, your tactics to achieve these things. And then, how did you do? Evaluate your results. So that's planning. Organizing. By this, we're talking about organizational structure. How are you going to divide up the different jobs that must be done? You may be the only one doing them. If so, your division of labor is pretty simple. Then you're down to prioritizing the labor. Change of command. What are the lines of authority and responsibility? This has to be determined. And you need to have a bureaucracy. That's just establishing relationships within the organization. Why is this necessary? Because if you're successful, your business may grow, and you want to have a structure set forth and the relationships in place to allow that to happen. So that's the organizing function. The directing function. This deals with selecting, allocating, and training your personnel, getting people in the right positions, hiring them, assigning duties and responsibilities that are appropriate, not only with the position, but with the person you put there. Give result benchmarks that people need to achieve or that they are expected to achieve. Figure out a way to create a desire for success. Usually this is done by encouragement directly, and also figuring out what incentives motivate people. And then making sure the job is done and done correctly. And to do this, you have to have policies, procedures, and practices. And I know you may be thinking, well, gosh, there's only one or two people here. Lay all this out so that people are accountable and they understand. If people understand one another, they'll be more likely to pull together and to make a business successful. So what about the controlling function of management? This is about monitoring and evaluating your activities. It's about comparing your performance against the objectives that you set in your strategic plan. You've got to have reporting and tracking systems. This is particularly the case if you're dealing with a consumer product, produce, or anything like that. You've got to have reporting and tracking systems. Record keeping is a key. If you do this properly, you'll be able to get good information from the data you gather, and that will become complementary to your other management tasks, to your directing, to your organizing, to your planning. And proper controlling allows you to compensate for errors in judgment in unforeseen circumstances. And again, it's about policies, procedures, and practices. So now I want us to refocus at the end of our webinar on looking at farm demographics. You know, agriculture, particularly in the South and in the West, is becoming more and more diverse with respect to age, to gender, to ethnic origin of the operators and of the owners. And so what we're going to look at in the next slide and then in a video clip is to try to bring home these things that we've been talking about in these webinars to you and really hit home that it's possible and likely that if your desire is to become an agricultural operator or to become an agribusiness leader in the future, use these pieces of information for encouragement. Specifically on farmer demographics. I'm just going to leave this up here. People under 34 are increasing. Women now make up 30% of the total number of farm operators. You see there at the top, Spanish, Hispanic, or Latino is higher than ever. More African American, up to 12%, and more American Indian, it's up 5% of the farm operators. You see there, 58,475. This was in the 2012 Ag Census. More than 20% of all farmers are beginning farmers. They've been in business less than 10 years. And so you can see that there's a lot of opportunity here. Even though the total land of farms has decreased slightly by 1 million acres from 2007, the farms got a little bit bigger. Average farm size was 434 in 2012 compared to 418 in 2007. So farmer demographics is changing. You have an opportunity to write yourself into this change. And so what I want to do to conclude this webinar is to have you watch a video clip. It was produced by a Native American, and I think you will find it to be quite fascinating. Please give it your full attention, and thank you for being in this webinar with us.
Since the creation of the United States government has had a series of policies that sometimes very inconsistent with regard to Indian tribes and Native peoples in this country. Years of federal policy, including removal and assimilation, and now lives on reservations in Indian country throughout the United States, has led to a change in the way that we live and the way that our governments operate, but also the ways that we eat.
When that happens, foods change. And in many cases, when those removals and relocations and terminations were happening, other people's foods were substituted for what were our traditional foodways.
Places that were our Aboriginal territories, where we knew what to eat and what to hunt, what to gather. Those things were now changed by the trauma of removal to a new place.
We've gone from peoples on this continent who had deep ties to our foodways, and throughout the course of history have been continually separated from those foods.
Our opportunities now in our new homelands, where our tribal leaders have sometimes asked the question, do our people have enough food to eat? And that question has sometimes been answered with solutions through federal commodities programs or other sources of food that we're now finding out have been very unhealthy for our bodies.
There's history associated with this separation from our foods that's deeply tied to federal policy, but it's also deeply personal to every tribe.
Type 2 diabetes is an enormous problem throughout Indian country, and that's now manifesting itself not only through our elders and our adults, but also our children.
Traditional food is culture. It is everything about us. It's deeply intertwined with our ceremonies. It's deeply intertwined with our languages.
When we were stronger in our foods, we were healthier as a culture and healthier as a people. And we can be strong again through our foods.
Our tribes must work together in a cooperative effort to change policies on the foundational, but also on the tribal and federal levels.
Well, food deserts are defined under federal law to be any time that a community is separated from a potential food source, such as a supermarket, a grocery store, by 10 miles. But if you actually do an overlay of food deserts as defined in federal law with all of Indian country, every place in Indian country is a food desert.
There's no one fix-all answer to these problems. It's going to take addressing them from multiple points and from us all banding together.
All we have to do is decide that no longer will we be separated from our foods. No longer will we be separated from our traditional foods, but no longer will we be separated from healthy foods. We have to regain our health. It's central to the survival of all of our people. And we have to do it for ourselves and for our children and for our grandchildren, and now is the time.
Thank you for joining today's webinar. If you have any questions about this webinar or any of the other webinars, you can send an email to Dr. Goodwin at the email address you see on the screen. Thank you for your attendance at these webinars, and we look forward to seeing you at the summit.